what is it that is not poverty reducing when you work in a country like Burkina? Well, I would say, for instance, a rather strong program on democracy support, which is consisting of support to elections, support to organizations that are based in Ouagadougou, the capital, and not based in rural areas. Electrification programs could be judged as pro-poor growth if it's done in certain ways, but in other ways perhaps not. I've struggled a bit with the classification of things. For instance, what is called climate change or climate adaptation programs. You need to understand what it really does, because there's so much jargon. So some of that is quite good at reducing poverty, I would say. So you need to get below that label and see the content of it. But then the broader question, which also you raised here on priorities and comprehensiveness, well, I would assume that you should have a sort of deliberate strategy or deliberate position on this. We need to focus. We need to do certain things carefully and thoroughly, and we should leave others. But what I've met is that it doesn't seem to be so much a discussion about this. It's rather that if we can get an intervention to fit into this broader framework of poverty relevant, it's fine. So what I'm lacking is this more strategic thinking, and I think also that perhaps my interest in this comes from having earlier written papers about poverty situation in some of these countries, or particularly one which have met quite limited interest. Of course, that's the fate of the researcher, that people seldom read what you write. But I would think that discussions about poverty and the dynamics in a country would be highly relevant for an aid donor. But I met that lack of interest in that, so that have brought me into this question. Why is it, and why is that not more important? In these documents, are there discussions about the poverty profile in countries? No, I haven't found that. And there has been a tendency in SIDA, as in, I understand, some other donor agencies, towards shorter, more condensed papers and documentation. So all these difficult questions of context and so is left out often. And you get, it has to be crisp, they say. The documents, and this is a clear trend, I'd say, in Sweden. Do I put do I make it too difficult for SIDA with this? Probably yes, and I am probably very unfair, because this schedule which I created is not something that SIDA has been working with or has had a chance to react to or something. On the other hand, it's not very different from, if you look at the content of the chronic poverty report, it's meant to reduce chronic poverty, yes, but if you read a number of research reports and books on poverty reduction. The messages are there. The dynamics of poverty and the various Anirudh Krishna's excellent work, what UNU Wider and the RECOM program has written. The message is there, so it should be known to aid donors. So in that sense, I don't think I'm too unfair. And if the objective is poverty reduction, well, does anything go? If it's just poverty relevant, is that enough to have poverty reduction? I would say that we should look at something similar to what comes up in the chronic poverty report, even to have poverty reduction. So I don't think I'm so unfair, at least. Yeah. I think I touched on these issues now, at least. Maybe.
Yes, thank you. Let's open it up now for discussion. I've got a few issues, but let's see if they emerge. Those of you who are sitting behind me, you'll have to shout.
I have a mic.
Oh, you have a mic. Wonderful. Thank you, Karen. Anybody like to? Yes, please. Could you say who you are when you? And I think I must apologise. I didn't say who I was at the beginning. I'm Andrew Shepherd, and I'm here at ODI. I work in the Chronic Poverty Advisory Network. Yeah, please.
Thank you, and thank you for an interesting presentation. My name is Camilla Nyström, and I'm doing a PhD here in IDS. But I'm sorry. Okay.
Oh, you have a good voice.
Yeah. Okay, but I have also been working with Swedish SIDA, so I think this presentation really interesting, and I also think you're not really that unfair to SIDA. I recognize a lot of things that you say, and I think it's also being debated within SIDA during the last few years, that there has been concerns that it's not so much poverty discussions on how to alleviate poverty anymore. The discussion has been on other issues. So I just wonder, how has SIDA or the Foreign Ministry reacted to the report? I mean, if it has been presented to them, and what their overall comments has been from the leadership of SIDA.
Mats, let's take 2 or 3 comments and then give you a chance to respond to it, please.
Thank you very much. It's really, really very interesting. Given what you say, I've got 2 questions actually. Maybe you won't want to answer them both, but the first one is, what do you think is driving the allocation of aid if it isn't what it is written to be in the strategy? And secondly, is your perception that this is equally applicable to other bilaterals who have poverty in their strategy but perhaps have a equally mixed bag in their programming?
Sylvia, just say who you are.
Sorry, Sylvia Beals, Help Age International.
My name is Jutta Barth from the German Technical Corporation, and I think it links very much what you said before. Thank you very much, Mats, for the really interesting presentation. I think perhaps we don't have such a nice study, but I could imagine that we have some similarities. And it's very interesting to see, because I think we have an overall objective to reduce poverty, but when you see in the implementation, we have parallel objectives. For instance, in Germany, it's very important, all the issue about climate change or renewables or the energy. So therefore, I think it's very interesting what to classify as poverty reduction. Is it when it really addresses or has the impact, and this has to be written in a proposal directly to this and this group, or is it more on a structural way with a long-term impact? I don't have an answer, but I think it's an issue what we have to to tackle with. And the other point is, I know the Swedish colleagues abroad, and I think we are really also very similar as we do it. It's not that German corporation decides what is good for Burkina Faso. Normally you have your negotiations with the Burkina Faso government, and you decide there's 1 or 2, 3 priorities. So what we are thinking, how does this reflect what also our partners want, and what does it mean then on the other side? I think we never should separate this, because I think all the good development cooperation is the one who is advising or is giving support, but the main actors are in the countries.
Hi, I'm Fiona Case. I'm from SIPA. We've been working on some issues for SIDA, and it was on the same sort of issue of allocation and what's driving the allocation of money towards different policies in different countries, because I understand that in SIDA a lot of the policy is driven by the country team rather than from the HQ, and what impact does that dynamic have on the allocation of funds?
Anybody else? Let me add a couple of mine. At least one is a comment. Mats, I think Paddy mentioned that Sweden's aid program is small, but actually it should be recorded that Sweden gives 1% of its gross national income in aid, and there's been a steady increase over quite a period of time. So some of the things that you said, for example, that the share to agriculture has declined, and that, from your analysis of Burkina Faso, would seem to be an important issue. But in fact, it might be that the absolute amounts to agriculture have been still growing. Just the share, other things have also come online. Like others, I would be fascinated to know, why it is that Bangladesh and Zambia score so highly in your tables. So if you're going to do some more case studies, it would be really worth working out why they've produced such a high level of anti-poverty action. In Bangladesh, is it because of support for NGOs, basket funding for some of the big NGOs, which virtually all their work is or is it more complicated than that? And then just thinking about some of the things that you began to say about the organization, the absence of a strategic approach, this being satisfied with investments being poverty relevant and so on. I often feel with donor agencies that how they are set up, the organizational arrangements of the agency, the people they recruit, how they group those people in what kind of structure and so on, almost determines what kind of aid they give. There is some flexibility there, and you can get some change over, and sometimes a minister comes in who throws all the pieces in the air and they land in a different place or something like that. But there is a certain, and one of the things I remember about previous discussions of Swedish aid is that it's a generalist organization, and it doesn't allow for a huge degree of specialization. If you're an economist, you end up working on all kinds of, you might be working on human rights or whatever, and so on. And I wonder if a more strategic approach would have to be driven by a greater degree of specialization of one sort or another. I don't mean necessarily academic specialization, but some kind of specialization. And only if somebody took the decision to do that, would you then, at the other end, be delivering something that was a bit more strategic or focused. I'm not sure. Those were my thoughts anyway.
If I can respond, I think it goes quite well with Sylvia's question there and yours. What drives the allocation of aid? And of course, I don't have the answer to that because I haven't really studied that. But my thoughts are that one factor is, of course, history. You've started somewhere and you continue to do something. Another factor is political pressure from the headquarter or from the government. In the Swedish case, we have a fairly small ministry, government ministry, setting up the budgets and the letter of appropriation each year, deciding on country strategies, result strategies as they're called. Then we have the implementing agency for the bilateral aid, SIDA. There has always been tensions between these two. And my own homewoven analysis of this is that it's difficult to be a minister for development cooperation because it's a rather junior position in a government, and you're supposed to be active if you intend to move up the political ladder, whereas the activities in this field should be long-term, stable, predictable, so SIDA should be given great liberty at deciding what to do based on expertise, based on specialization, etc. But there's always this temptation or drive for a minister to involve him or herself into the daily business and come with directives saying that now you should deal with the private sector development, or now you should deal with human rights, or now you should deal with this or that, and that drives allocations at the country level. So it disrupted the sort of long-term strategic work. And if you on top of that have an organization where you have, Sweden is small, the country office in Burkina would be like 10 people, and among these there would be 3 people who are experts, 3 or 4 who are experts. So if you have an expert on democracy and human rights, you have an expert on natural resource management, you have an expert on macroeconomics, something else, then that would probably also decide where the money goes, because interventions come from these meetings with others, and you pick up something and you think that, well, we know something about this, and then we are interested in this, and so it becomes dependent on the people you have on the ground. So I would say that sort of the competence and the capacity of people on the ground is a very important thing, which is very often overlooked. And I fully agree that the role of the organization is absolutely key. The way it's structured and the way it works, the incentives, the way it can deliver different sorts of capacities and capabilities, and very often overlooked or forgotten. The share to agriculture declined. I think actually, if you look on the curve, it goes a bit up and down. So it's perhaps not really true to say that it has declined like that, but it's not that the absolute amount has increased. It has rather stayed stable, which as a share then makes it smaller. I think it has to do with we had in the 80s, 70s, 80s big programs, rural development programs, everything included. We had support to state farms in African countries, etc., and that failed it was a failure, more or less. And after that, many got tired of the sector. And then when there's a renewed interest, some 8-10 years ago, and then following on, many don't really know what to do, because now it's seen as private sector. And how do you support the private sector? You cannot intervene directly. You should do it more sort of structurally or through other means, and it's not so obvious what to do. And if you have lost during that period the competence on agriculture, on rural development in your staff, in your support structure behind universities, etc., then it's not so easy to increase it again. So I think these are the kinds of factors behind there. I think the sort of the money objectives behind aid is a factor determining what is done, and it's climate change. It's a climate $1 billion for the climate. It's a environmental program, and after 3 years, and then it's children and women, and then it's something else. So it shifts and disrupts the work that has to be done, and the effectiveness of the program. So it's a much bigger question. It's a much bigger issue, I think. And if this is the same in other bilaterals, well, I don't know, but I would guess so in countries that are close to ours. Norway or Denmark, I would guess it's rather similar, and in the UK you would know much better than me, some of you here. So
I think there are some similarities and some differences, probably. I would have expected to find UK aid much more openly and transparently concerned about donor coordination, for example, but I don't know whether that's actually the case. Maybe you would find the same. Paddy was suggesting that this was something quite uniform across bilateral agencies, which is, after all the emphasis on aid effectiveness and donor coordination and harmonization and following the government strategy and so on in the 1990s and the 2000s, and the amount of evidence that that's what leads to good aid, it's very disappointing in a way to hear this retreat from what constitutes good aid.
Yeah, and it was very obvious and dramatic in Sweden, I'd say.
Yes.
We had people sharing the DAC working group on aid effectiveness, and were involved in getting off the ground, and then all of a sudden there was no interest whatsoever, I'd say. No real interest whatsoever in Paris again. From Swedish side.
And perhaps having a non-specialized generalist organization is a reaction to a situation where you have shifting power shifting between different political parties, and the need to retain flexibility and adaptiveness, which is precisely runs against the kind of long-term strategic thinking that you're looking for. So it may be that the political dynamics in the aid-giving countries is a major obstacle. Anybody else have any Chiara? Yes?
No, just very quickly.
Use the microphone.
Of course.
And
What
yourself.
are you going to do now with this paper with
This
respect to the
paper?
Swedish
Yes.
cooperation?
I hope to finish it, and this, and from today I started to think in this morning session when you presented and the following discussion, I perhaps thought that I should have taken another direction in the case studies, because it seems as if the risk is that this becomes technocratic and looking at sort of the it's rather square, whereas the interesting thing is whether there is a social progressive social change in a country, and how do you promote that as a donor? Can you do it? And how do you relate to these issues? So maybe that would be even more interesting thing to look at. But to do that, would be to really then you need fieldwork and sort of be there.
That would be quite interesting, though, because you may find actually that Swedish aid on the ground has been, it may not be measured so easily, but has actually been quite active in,
Mm.
you know, maybe small amounts of money. You might have missed some of the most important
Sure.
projects in terms of catalyzing
Yeah.
social change. It's possible, isn't it?
Mm.
It would be another sort of study, though. Yeah, Silva.
Yeah, can I say as well, I think it's right that it's not finished, is it, your work? I mean, it's sort of just beginning, really, because there are also other ways in which Swedish aid is spent. For example, HelpAge gets a partnership grant, which, you know, is against the strategy of the organisation and has a big focus on social protection and older people's agency and that kind of thing. But it's not necessarily that work that CEDA does, which is so important, thought about as part of its aid programme. But it is, and it has a lot of different, you know, aid relationships with the NGO and the UN sector and so on. So it would be really good also to kind of think how one gets a handle on that too, and the relationship, because I'm very interested, you know, what you say about social protection, for example. Our CEDA colleagues have said for a long time that they wish social protection was more central.
Cara, can you give the microphone to Julie?
In the more central in the programme, because it, you know, it's clearly poverty reducing. It's, you know, the work that how you've related it to the chronic poverty model is also there. But even with all that evidence, it's still not. You call it thin, I think, thinly represented. And why is that? But on the other hand, support for, say, us, where social protection is so important, is very clear. So it would be interesting to look at that, those dynamics, and really think, sort of, I guess this will be really helpful for those in CEDA who are wanting to join the dots, sort of make the connections better.
The discussion on social protection in Sweden has evolved tremendously over the last 2 years, I would say. There was it was not seen as an area to work in just some years ago. Then all of a sudden, a lot shifted from within. Well, I'm generalizing a bit too much now, because there have been people within CEDA promoting social protection for quite some time and doing good work on that for quite some time, but they have been sort of a bit marginal, and it has not been part of the general discussion in Sweden. But then when it was seen as an international debate, it sort of came home to Sweden as well. So there's a shift. It remains to be seen what that means in practice. You have this tension that some tend to see it as sort of part of a Nordic or Swedish model for society that maybe is to be exported. Others see the dangers of that. You cannot really export a model. You need to it has to grow from within. So where it will move, I don't know, but I think that it will happen quite a lot in that area in the near future. That's my guess. And of course, there is also another issue here. My paper is sort of focused on I try to measure money. That is one way of looking at aid, but aid might be also what you do, the content, and you can achieve much with very little money. So I miss that in my paper, but I'm privately aware of it.
Yeah.
So to take this further, that must be part of further work. but I mean, you're limited by the approach you choose in a paper.
Mats, thank you very much. I think that's been a really interesting session, and it's, I mean, obviously the paper is limited, but nevertheless it's enabled us to get inside some of the dynamics of Swedish aid in a very interesting way. And thank you very much for coming over and presenting it.
Thanks to you all, because this has been a great opportunity for me to get input to this ongoing work. So I have now new ideas and new inspiration.
Thanks to Lucy and Paddy in his absence for
thanks a lot
commenting and reading the paper and so on.